Hi, I'm Robert Jacobson, author of Space is Open for Business and founder of Space Advisors. We help organizations develop their strategy for space. Today, we're talking about how you can become a space entrepreneur or an astro-preneur. We're going to be breaking the myths of the trillion-dollar space economy. And number 3, what are the mainstream brands that are getting involved with the space economy? Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us here on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? You know the saying, the sky's the limit, but clearly that's no longer the case. In fact, NASA recently awarded a $2.9 billion lunar lander contract to Elon Musk's SpaceX. So back in the day, I wonder how many leaders said, I can actually remember some saying it, you know, this internet thing, it's a fad, you know, those same leaders are maybe scraping a living together. Here's what you might want to get curious about. How many leaders today are saying this whole space thing is a fad? It's not for us. It's just for an elite couple of people. You know, it's for the Elon Musks of the world, not for the rest of us. If that's you, today you're going to get a chance to completely rethink that. So stay tuned, because that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go over to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. And by the way, this episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart and your mind and your soul have been craving. And talking about space, a couple of our guests on there, astronauts. Yep, we've had those. Frank White, who wrote The Overview Effect about going out into space. So there's some pretty cool stuff on there too. This is your chance to sit in on some real and often intense conversations with some of the most interesting people. Like I said, you know, astronauts, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, Grammy award-winning entrepreneur, entertainers. I mean, it just is fascinating. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find this podcast and Curiosity Bites on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. And as always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please go over there, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. We really appreciate that. And if you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. If you can also listen to us through Google Home or Alexa by simply saying play Dov Baron podcast. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Like I said, when the internet first started, many in the public struggled to understand its relevance to business or leadership. Yet today, the United States alone, just the United States, e-commerce sales are expected to surpass $740 billion by 2023. Now let's look at the space industry. Is it out there? Nothing to do with you? Well, according to the Bank of America, they expect the space industry to triple to 1.4 trillion as a market within a decade. So how can you and your organization make sure that you don't miss the boat, or rather miss the economic rocket ship? How can you tap into this burgeoning space economy? Well, let's find out together, because our guest today is Robert Jacobson, and he is an astro entrepreneur. He's a leader in the new space sector, advocating how space could be a trillion-dollar industry within a decade and it could transform humanity. Robert Jacobson is the founder of Space Advisors, a strategic and financial consulting firm for space startups. His decade plus of professional experience in NewSpace includes role at Arch Mission Foundation, where he notably worked to initiate the first solar library. That was the payload famously launched by Elon Musk's Tesla in 2018. And Space Angels, the world's first space-focused angel investment group. On top of that, he and I both met because we're involved in Frank White's Space for Humanity network. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the author of Space is Open for Business, Robert C. Jacobson!
Thank you, Dov. I love that introduction. That was awesome. I feel so pumped and honored to be here.
Thank you, mate. I'm really happy to have you on air. Really appreciate it. I always like to start the show with this simple question, and the question is this: in this world of influencers, where everybody's claiming to be an influencer, who is somebody who influenced you in the way that you lead? It might be somebody we'd never think of, or somebody that we may have never even heard of. Who would that person be for you?
A very important person would be the late Dr. Steve Sample. He was a trained electrical engineer, and most notably, I think a several decade president of the University of Southern California. Very influential in terms of the growth of that university. That was my alma mater for undergraduate, and he wrote a book or co-wrote a book called The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership. And it is a fantastic book that I still come back to. And in a lot of, it's just a real staple for my diet and my life.
What, if you had to pick something from that book or from that teaching, from that person that you would pass on to leaders and say, this is, like, you got to get this, what would it be?
Well, this is one that comes, one point that comes off the top of my head is that, like, when in battle and dealing with, potentially contentious things, potential failure, take a survey of the landscape and know which hill you're willing to die on. And that's an uncomfortable thought for a lot of people, but death of organizations, of individuals, happens to everything. Nothing is forever, and it is sometimes good to take an assessment and a survey and just simply say, where, if your values are here, where are you willing to plant that flag and die for it? And I think it's a worthy meditation.
Yeah. Still to this day, I think that, in fact, I think that probably more today than ever in the noise is you got to know what it is you really stand for, what is the hill you're willing to die on. And if you're not, then you need a different focus. You've not found your thing yet.
Yeah.
I think it's great advice.
Yeah. And another leader who was probably a younger me, who's very influential and definitely directly affected my way of entering the space movement, was Richard Branson. Now, I remember as a kid, my parents took me on with a family friend on a sailing trip. We went into the British Virgin Islands. Had never been on never been on a sailing trip before. It was a very special experience. We got to spend several days cruising through the Virgin Islands. It wasn't really fancy or anything, but I think it was 11 or 12, but it was super valuable. And we dropped anchor in front of Necker Island. I didn't know what Necker Island was, and they were explaining that the guy who owned Virgin Records, Richard Branson, he wasn't a knight yet, owned it. And at the time when we were parked offshore, there was a lot of military presence off the water because Princess Diana was actually staying on the island at that day. So I didn't see her or anybody on,
no.
but it was just kind of captivating that, wow, some person can like have their own island. And then many years later, I ended up meeting him at a book signing, and I got his at the Virgin Records store in West Hollywood, California.
See, now you're aging yourself. Record store.
Yeah, it was the Virgin Record store, but I was like
Yeah.
18 or 19,
Yeah.
and he signed my book. And then later, in 2004, I went to the very first flight of Spaceship One. Now, Virgin was not yet involved. This was the pre-competition flight of Spaceship One, which was funded by the late Paul Allen and led by Burt Rutan, the very famous aircraft designer. And so I went to that flight with a friend of mine, and it was just a catalyst. It was just a catalyst for me entering the space sector. I grew up in Florida, knew about the space program, wanting to be an astronaut as a little kid, but I didn't think NASA was going to be my path. And it was not until the X Prize started emerging that I realized this might be something. I don't really know how, but then after seeing the actual flight on October 1st, 2004, it literally affected me at the core in such a way that I said, I've got to be a part of this. I don't even know how, but I'm going to immerse myself in this.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How did it start? Because you're talking about being an astro-preneur, right? And the space sector, of course, is a brand new to the public, at least. It's it's like almost not even real for most people. But you've been involved in it for a long time. And when Diamantis got involved, with the X Prize and those kinds of things, I still think that for a lot of people, it's not real. As I said, what made you recognize that this is the entrepreneurial Wild West, the brink of a burgeoning economy?
So around this time of Spaceship One, or shortly after Spaceship One, I was doing my own research. This is like before Facebook, and it just like, and I literally was driving out to this quiet desert airport called Mojave Airport that was becoming an inland spaceport. But I quickly realized that it was a Monday to Friday operation. I'm coming out there on Saturdays. It's kind of all closed. And they all said, you would have better success looking in your backyard. Look down in Los Angeles or other areas. Or this is a kind of a Monday through Friday operation. So I go back to Los Angeles, meet some people who end up sort of mentoring me about, understanding what's going on the landscape while still understanding what's going on locally, just doing kind of my own business development. And we ended up, and I say we, through an investment firm that I was working with, acquired a newspaper that was in the same county, Kern County, California, near the same area where some of these engineers were living who had worked down at the airport. And getting to know some of them, I just started having these sort of conversations. When you're running a newspaper, you have collisions of, Chamber of Commerce events, Kiwanis. It's a little bit of collision and serendipity. And I started meeting people and hearing about conversations that provided access points to investment and business that were in the broader aerospace sector. And that was, gave me sort of early access to saying, okay, there's some businesses supporting this, and just learning about what the actual current business was and was not. So there was a lot of self-education and research at the moment. And space is kind of difficult for some people because it's both a destination and kind of a concept. And for people to understand, well, where exactly is space?
Yeah.
The internationally accepted boundary of space is 100 kilometers above sea level, or 62 miles for us less evolved folks in the United States that are still using that system. Or if you're in Denver, it would be 61 miles. And so space is this invisible thing. We can't touch it. It's difficult for most of us to see. But when we all go out at night, we've had for hundreds of thousands of years, we look up at the sky. We're influenced by it. We know that our tides, we know that animal movements, migration can be affected by it. So there's this things that we know innately how it affects us. But what we don't understand is they say, well, how is it a global economy? People think, well, okay, I know there's like NASA's in Florida. Well, no, that's not completely the case. NASA actually has centers all around the United States. There's no ATMs in space. There's no banks in space. So even if you want to hate on all of this, the money that is actually spent on even things like governmental space trickles down to contractors and subcontractors that are spread out through all 50 United States, or if you're in Canada or in other parts of the world, through your regional, space agencies. So it's actually a lot more nuanced, and it's not, as I say in my book, space is not a monolith. It's actually a broad and interdisciplinary and interlinked sector. So like if you do go spend, you go to your, put some petrol or gas in your vehicle, when you put your credit or debit card in, there's a very good chance that signal touched a satellite somewhere in that transaction.
Yes.
Or other types of things for commerce, daily commerce.
Yeah. So when we see, and this is why I wanted to have you on for the show, because I think that when people think about space is open for business, which of course is the title of your book, they're thinking about. It's easy to think about, okay, at a big level, I'm a provider of something for NASA, like, whatever that might be. And I get a NASA contract and I got to compete with everybody else. And I got to be so big to do that. So that's beyond me. Or, they're going to open a grocery store on Mars and, and I guess I could be part of that. It seems to be like at either end of this ridiculous spectrum. And so I really want you to sort of help us to grasp the idea that space is open for business if you're not a multi-billionaire, i.e. Bezos or Musk, or you're not a governmental body. So talking to let's just go entrepreneur for a while here for a minute. Talking to the average entrepreneurial person who is now fully, as an example, it's not the case, but just as an example, is fully supported by Amazon. People think Amazon is a company, and it is, but as a retailer, it's actually a support system for tiny entrepreneurs, often, right? So who often will grow into bigger businesses. And I'm seeing space as being like thinking as an Amazon place that people are providing things. Am I on the right path, or am I whacked?
That is a part of it. And actually, let's talk about Amazon as an example. So Amazon has one of their businesses is AWS, which is a large part of their business, and they basically had this large computer infrastructure, leftover space, old servers, whatever, and they found a way to remonetize it. And they've got government, private customers. It's become a massive business for them. Well, they've now recently launched their own accelerator around the AWS accelerator, and I've talked to them. They're particularly interested in aerospace now. Mm-hmm. So let's just say you've got an entrepreneur. We'll assume we have entrepreneurial mindsets if we're listening to this program. But let's look to our own backyard. Maybe you own an insurance company. Maybe you have a logistics company or something along like that. And you say, okay, I know this business pretty well. Just do a little bit of your own research, just seeing where does space connect with whatever my own backyard. And there you might find, oh wow, there's actually some opportunities here, or this is how the market's currently being served. And then you say, okay, I found this really compelling idea. I'm in this current business area, this terrestrial focus. I see an adjacency. I don't quite know how to merge it. Is it a subsidiary? Is it a JV? Am I just telling my wife, hey, we're packing up and we're moving to Seattle to do a space startup, whatever that might be. But a group like this new accelerator, and there's many that could be supportive. I'm just using this one to illustrate it because you mentioned Amazon. Mm-hmm. They would be willing to work with entrepreneurs to sort of take this, this idea, say maybe you're working in insurance, or, there's probably all sorts of wild, crazy things we could think of, figure out how Amazon, what it can do to help support that business, And then there are people that are tasked with helping and working with entrepreneurs. And I don't even think they're taking equity. I think it's a relatively low friction, easy to swallow type of deal. If you pass the qualifications and get accepted to the program, where there are these accelerators and incubators that will help you there. So that's like one area. And if you do have and maybe you're maybe more fresh, a junior, fresh out of school, I would say it's a great opportunity to take a part of internships with other space companies, even if it's just for a summer, just to learn a little bit about the business. You might say, "Hey, I don't want to do anything. I did my time here, and I'd like to do something else." But it's actually there's no better time, I think, to become a space entrepreneur. And you might think, "Well, I don't have $1 million or $1 billion," but most of us have like a phone. And you've got, it's not like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk has a different type of access to the internet. If we have access to the internet, we all have the same access to the internet. And you can reach out to just about anyone on the planet, anybody in this industry, and you'll find that actually people are pretty supportive and willing to talk. So even if you think, I don't know anything about this, you can do a little reading and your own sort of research to find out what resonates with you and where do you see a gap that needs to be filled, because there's still plenty in this emerging area. It's not, this is a multi-generational type of new industry that's being built on the backs of things like the Apollo program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I know because of my own research, but I know that there are many of the things that we use today as everyday things are actually came from, people go, there were many people who argued, what a complete waste of money going to the moon, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I can get the practicality of it in a practical level. So what? But the technological advances that we use every single day in your freaking microwave oven, in your toaster, and certainly in your phone, a lot of it, that technology came from the work that was done in the space program. By the way, just in case you don't know, this thing, right, your phone now contains more technology than it took to launch Apollo 11. That's just just get a grasp of that. Like they launched a man to the men to the moon.
3 people.
Right? 3 people to the moon with less technology than you've got in your freaking iPhone. So that kind of gives you a clue. But in the context of all that, there's still this thing of there's still a disconnect here, Robert, and I want to jump on it. I want to get people to grasp it, because it seems like, okay, we could do some research, but I'm not going to. I've got a business to run. I'm not it's not like I'm seeing something. So many people are thinking, well, I'll wait, like they did with the internet. Well, I'll wait. And I want to help them to see from your point of view that space is already open for business, and where can they get into it now?
So the now is probably that, and this is probably this will be a link between the Internet 1, 2, 3.0, whatever you want to call it, and space is that data is a type of energy. It's a new oil, whatever analogy you want to look.
Yes.
And we all have an increasing appetite and need, personally, professionally, for our worlds to function for it.
Yes.
And space assets, an asset could be any physical item in space, whether it's a telescope, and telescopes looking like Hubble is basically a repurposed spy satellite. Shocker, if people didn't realize that, it is basically. That was a telescope facing away from the Earth. But we also have these telescopes that are facing to the Earth, and they're not all just for like spying on like what other countries are doing naughty things, or to verifying a nuclear weapons agreement. But they actually have now more broader uses that include monitoring deforestation, fires, ship traffic, migration of anything, people or animals, boats, monitoring, traffic coming in and out, looking at methane emissions. It goes really broad. And then there's other types of, and you can do this with telescopes, and you can also do this with where you put radars. And you go, well, why do you need, like, what's the difference between one and the other? Well, the telescopes, you can get better resolution. So if you need to see, color or other granularity, you can do that. You're taking pictures. Radar, you can see through the cloud. So if you look at those maps, the radar maps, they'll look a little different, but you could look through the clouds. And that can be very helpful because most of the planet is covered in clouds most of the time. And there's now these privately funded satellites where they're putting these constellations and they are generating this new data. And then there's sometimes it happens within the satellite owner, or sometimes it happens through kind of a third party where there's developers that are building analytics that take that data to create actionable insights. Because if you just have a bunch of pictures, you're like, okay, that's overwhelming. How's that useful? I'm an oil manager. I'm looking for sites or whatever my role is. You need that intelligence quickly, and it needs to be something you can act on and make informed decisions on. So that's happening in different ways. There's new forms of weather satellites coming on, and this is actually fascinating. I did not know this until just a few years ago, is that weather data was typically provided by governments as a soft form of diplomacy. So they, could give, whether, I think like U.S. would give it to countries in Southeast Asia. They didn't want, other adversarial countries that there maybe, or competitive countries, so, further influencing the region. So they do these things through forms of, soft diplomacy. So now NOAA, which is the United States' National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, has its own weather satellites. They've got a pilot program going that's been quite successful, where they've challenged the commercial market, said, hey, provide us commercial data. We'll buy a certain amount of data. Let's see if it works. And there are companies now building new types of satellites that are providing new types of more granular forms of weather data, and going, well, why would somebody pay for weather if it's already free? Well, there's people, and say if you're working in agriculture, agribusiness, you're thinking about, futures, you're thinking about these things. Like, it is important to know in both a short-term and longer-term thinking how your farms are operating. So there's this capability that's coming out online. And then there's the telecommunications side. Well, we've had, we actually had in the 90s, we had things like Iridium and Globalstar, which were early efforts on using satellites to connect to phones and devices to varying degrees of effectiveness. It definitely worked, but it was very expensive. But because, as Dov, you were talking about, everybody's got these smartphones, and because of electronic miniaturization, the same parallel has happened in the satellite business, is that you can put more components for less money in small satellites. So there is still a market for very large satellites. Sometimes they're almost as large as a bus and can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Very high performance, very expensive. They will usually, very large businesses and governments will still want those. But there's also this parallel activity where they're building smaller satellites. Think of it like your iPhone, almost disposable, high performance. And then when you aggregate the power of all those smaller satellites, it becomes incredibly powerful. And then when they become, when you need to upgrade, you upgrade the software, or you deorbit them, or you recycle them, and you put on version 2.0. So that and all of that capability is coming online, so to speak. So even if you don't want to operate or develop that, because it does have a significant capex, you can take advantage of that and develop your own applications to ride upon that infrastructure that is being built. And hopefully I tried to illustrate that in a
So as we come towards the end of part one of this two-part show, where I really want to go in the next one is I want you to, if you can, for us to share with us some examples of, space being open for business for the regular guy or gal person. And maybe you've got an example of somebody who was able, because I know you're part of angel financing and all those kind of things, but somebody who was able to take something and apply it in a very practical way to that new space economy, who could really sort of give us a shining example on the hill. Because I think a lot of the time, like I said, it still feels very ethereal. As you said, space is not a place. And so doing the economy in space seems weird. But that's why I use the example of the internet, because it's also not a place. But most of our economies are run from there now. So I want to come back into that. And I want to come back into understanding that. I also want to come into looking at where is this boom going to be? Maybe we can talk a little bit about the idea of asteroid mining and what happened to that, and talk about the whole idea of how somebody can create a strategy to be part of that economics. So we are, as I said, we are here with Robert Jacobson. He is the author of Space is Open for Business. We're coming towards the end of this first part of the show. And Robert, just please tell people where they can find out more about you and your book, and then we'll come back for part two.
Yeah. So for my book, spaceisopenforbusiness.com, and that has a lot of other things about me, robertjacobson.com, and my professional consulting site, spaceadvisors.com. And those three areas are great ways you can learn more.
Fabulous. And we'll make sure, of course, that we share those in all the podcast notes. And we'll see you for part two of this interview in the next click. So just click away. And remember, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. See you with Robert Jacobson, Space is Open for Business, in part two.